Good afternoon, everybody. I'm glad to be up here again, and I'm glad to be doing this study that I've been doing. I've gotten a lot out of this study myself as I've been studying to be up here and teach y'all. It's definitely sharpened a lot of the information that I went over in school, and I think that for me, it's been a great blessing, and it's been a great sharpening of my own skills, and I hope that it's been a great blessing to all of you, and hopefully I've been able to deliver some information that you've never heard before or sparked an interest in study. So today, we're going to kind of delve deeply more into the historical side of the Gospels. I know in the past 2 weeks we've looked primarily a lot at the Bible and some of the scriptures in the Bible, and there will be some scriptures we use today. But a lot of what we're going to talk about today is going to be from a historical perspective. And I know it's going to be a lot of information, and I know it's going to be a lot of stuff that maybe some of you are not familiar with. So if you have any questions or any comments or anything, please feel free to speak up or raise your hand or do whatever you need to do to ask. But we're going to have this study today. This is going to be, I would call, part one, because with dealing with history, especially, you can't cut out a lot of history. I felt it a disservice to kind of trim down a lot of the information that I'm going to cover today, because in the previous two classes, I was able to trim out a lot of information I felt that I didn't need to get across, or that was diving too deep into some other stuff. But today and probably next week, I figured that I'm just going to give it to you as raw and as unfiltered as I can, because I think it's a disservice to history if I cut things out or I don't include it, because then you can't get the full picture of what's going on. But today, that's what we're going to be talking about, is history. So at the end of all of our Bible's Old Testament, we have the book of Malachi. And during the time of the book of Malachi, the Israelites are underneath the thumb of the Persian Empire. And when the book of Malachi closes, we know, or some of us are familiar with the fact that there are 400 years that pass between the Old Testament and the beginning of Matthew in the New Testament. And there is a lot that happens in that time between the testaments. We call that the intertestamental period. Many people call that the period of silence. There's a lot of people that refer to it as the time that God was silent. There was no prophets. There was no revelation from God. There was nothing that went on in that time for God's people that had to do with God until the birth of Jesus. And that's important because his message and his dealings with his people, the Israelites, was done in the book of Malachi. And he had something new and something ready for them, and that was Jesus. But there's a history that happened in that time period that's important to understand, because the world that Jesus comes into is something that's completely different than we leave off of in the book of Malachi. There are groups of people, there are parties, religious parties, there are new empires that are in play. There's all these different types of people that we see in the New Testament that if we didn't know the history behind it, we would lose the full meaning of what the New Testament authors are getting across. So you can kind of break down the timelines, I guess you could say, into three portions. And you can look on your outline underneath number one. The first portion we're all going to be very familiar with. That is the Old Testament period. And in the Old Testament period, the three major empires that ruled over the Israelites, or the Jewish nation, was the Assyrian Empire. And they, of course, ruled from 722 to 605. And so they were superseded by the Babylonian Empire in 605 and up until 539 BC. And then finally the Persian Empire, or you'll hear it referred to as well as the Medo-Persian Empire, from 539 to 334. And in our Bibles, we have mentions of each of these empires. I know Clint covered it a little beast that come out in the prediction of the upcoming empires that would happen. But if you want scriptural references, for the Assyrian Empire and the conquering of the northern kingdom, you can go to 2 Kings chapter 17, verses 1 through 6. For the southern kingdom conquered by the Babylonians, they conquered Jerusalem and they conquered the entirety of Judea, and then as well as Jerusalem. And you can see that in 2 Kings 24, verses 10 through 20, and then 2 Kings 25. And then finally, the Persian Empire is mentioned plenty of times in the latter part of the Old Testament, especially in the prophets. The prophets primarily deal with a lot of the dealings of the Persian Empire. And you can find that, for reference, I put Daniel 5 and Daniel 6. That's a lot where he talks about King Darius the intertestamental period. And this is the period that we're primarily going to talk about today for this study. And this is, I think, the most influential and the biggest cultural change that the Israelites went through. And this was the time period where the Macedonian Greek Empire, ruled by Alexander the Great and Philip of Macedonia, from 334 to 166 BC, and you can see that's a long time that they ruled. And then you have Jewish independence and the Hasmonean dynasty, as well as the Maccabean revolt from 166 to 63 BC. And I kind of broke down the dates, and we'll kind of get more into those here in a second, of Alexander the Great, the Ptolemaic domination, and the Seleucid domination. And then finally we arrive at our own New Testament, where the Romans coming in and conquering Judea, as well as the arisal of the Herodian dynasty, the arisal of the Roman procurators, and then, of course, I listed some other major dates that happened under this time period: the destruction of Jerusalem and the Second Jewish Revolt that ends the Jewish state in AD 135. So we're going to start with the Persian period. Our Bibles do cover, like I said, a little bit of this time. And like I mentioned earlier, the greater part of our Old Testament books has to do with the goings-ons of the Israelites under the Persian rule. In the Bible, the primary leader that's listed was King Cyrus, who was the ruler at the time. And the Persians, they had recently conquered Babylon in 539 and became the superpower over the Jewish people. But as we know in our Bibles, they were allowed to go back to Jerusalem. They were allowed to go, and the willingness to be open to other cultures and open to other things. And he was, what's the word for that? Tolerating. He was tolerating of other people. And so he sent them back. But the problem that went on with that is the Jewish population was in captivity for so long. The northern kingdom was in captivity, I think, for 200 to 300 years, something like that. And then the southern kingdom was in captivity for 70 years. And so the problem that arises a lot is there's generations of Jews that have grown up not living in Jerusalem. There's generations of Jews that have grown up not living in Judea, living in Palestine. They're used to the way of living in Syria. They're used to the way of living in Babylon. So when this king, only a few, tens of thousands of people were interested in going back and doing that and rebuilding the temple, rebuilding the walls, rebuilding Jerusalem. And we see that in our own Bibles in Ezra chapter 1 chapter 1 through 6. He went back with people, or not he himself, but he records people going back and rebuilding the city and the temple in Jerusalem. And then later, more people would follow, with Ezra himself being with him in Ezra chapter 7 through chapter 10. And then not only that, but we have the 6, and it's speculated that was around 445 BC. And Malachi was also written in this time period, sometime around 430 BC. So you can get kind of that time period that between the time period of 539 and 334, when the Persians were ruling over the Jews, around the 450s mark is when they were allowed to return back to Jerusalem and Judea and go and rebuild. And that's kind of the latter part of our Old Testament. The interesting thing that happened during this time, as I had mentioned, is especially with all these people that don't want to go back to their homeland because their homeland is all they know, which is just another word for saying dispersed. So instead of having all of these culturally Jewish people, these Hebrew people in one place in Palestine or Judea, now you have them all over the Mediterranean world. You have them in Syria, you have them in Babylon, there were some in Egypt, there were some in Turkey. You have them all around because when these empires came and they conquered them, they spread them everywhere. Just like any nation that comes in and conquers someone, their inhabitants scatter. So now these Jewish people who are used to being in one area and worshiping on the Temple Mount and doing all these things in Judea and Palestine are now everywhere. So how are they going to worship? Think of something. So the thing that arose during this time was the synagogues. So that's where we start to see the rise of the synagogue practices, because now instead of going to the temple, you can have temple at home, basically. You can have this worship and you can have this communion with other people of like minds, these other Hebrews, in this dedicated building. And there would arise people, and we'll cover it later, especially when we get into religious context, but this is where the Pharisaical party arises. The Pharisees were the primary drivers of the synagogue movement. That's where this, political or religious party would have arisen from, is from the synagogue movement. And their core beliefs will be solidified later whenever the Seleucids come into play. We'll cover that here in a second. But you have the rise of synagogues whenever the Jews were allowed to basically disperse and go back to their homeland. And because they had nowhere to worship, when they were dispersed, they couldn't go back to the temple. So what do? You create your own place to worship, hence the synagogues. And this is also the beginning of the oral law, which is going to be a big issue that Jesus deals with in the New Testament. The particular passage that comes to my mind is in Matthew chapter 5, when he's doing the Sermon on the Mount. What does he say at the beginning of a lot of his passages? You have heard that it was what? You have heard that it was said. Jesus is alluding to the oral law. Because during this time, when you're dispersed, are you really concerned about what tribe you're a part of? Because, these tribes, some tribes could be over here, some tribes could be over here. They're not always going to be around priests. They're not always going to be around Levites. They're not going to be around people that can guide them spiritually. So what do they create? Oral law. Things that they had heard from their grandparents, from their parents, from people around them. Moral things that they all collectively agreed were, hey, we should, like Jesus says in Matthew 5, you have heard that it was said, love your neighbor as yourself. In the Old Testament, is that written anywhere? I would argue that it's not. But where did Jesus get that from? Oral law. He got that from oral law. It was something that they had collectively agreed that, hey, we all need to love each other because we're neighbors. And that became set in stone law that they were practicing and binding on people. Because you have these religious leaders, these Pharisees that are leading in the synagogues, and they don't have any Levites, they don't have any temple to go to, so they have to create their own law. They have to create their own word of mouth law. And that's where you get oral law. And as we know, with speaking, things tend to get a little skewed. Things tend to get a little lost in the shuffle. And that's the problems that Jesus had to deal with in the Gospels. He had to deal with this traditionalism of adhering to this oral law that started when they were dispersed all throughout the Mediterranean world. So not only that, we had the establishment of the Aramaic language as well. So we have all these Hebrew-speaking Jews that are now dispersed into this massive empire of Persia, and the main language of the Persians was Aramaic. And so if you're going to be a citizen of this empire, what language do you have to start speaking? Aramaic. And so the Jews began adopting this language as their own common language, as well as Hebrew. And of course, in our own New Testament, there are passages in Aramaic. I know, for example, you have in Mark chapter 15, verses 33 through 34, that's when Jesus is on the cross and he cries out, Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani. That is, my God, why have you forsaken me? That's in Aramaic. Jesus was speaking in Aramaic. And Mark especially has plenty of passages, and he has different sayings that Jesus said, and he lists it in Aramaic because that's what Jesus spoke. Because what was Jesus? He was a Jew. And what did the Jews speak at that time as their common tongue? Aramaic. That's what they spoke. And that's because they got that from the Persians. And that's how they learned to speak Aramaic. And then comes the Greeks. So a little known king named Philip of Macedonia decided one day that he wanted to project his power over the Greek mainland. And he reformed the armies of Macedonia. He reformed the military, the government structure of Macedonia, and turned it into a Greek superpower. And that Greek superpower projected its power all across the Greek, I don't want to say continent, but the Greek mainland, if you want to call it that. And then they projected out. And after Philip of Macedonia died, his son Alexander, at the ripe age of 20, took the throne. And Alexander shared his father's need and want for conquest. And in a short 13 years, Alexander the Great conquered much of the known world at the time. And with that conquering led with a lot of spread of Greek culture. And that's where you get the word Hellenization. And that comes from, so Greece in Greek is Hellas. And so when it's Hellenization, that's basically the Greekification, or you're Greekifying the cultures and you're spreading the culture of the Greeks to the people that you've conquered. So in that short 13 years of conquest, Alexander spread rapidly the culture of the Greeks. And he built many cities in the image of the Greek cities that he came from. The biggest city that would come to mind to all of your minds is the city of Alexandria in Egypt. Of course, named after its namesake, Alexander. This, of course, was the epitome of Hellenization in the Mediterranean world. But what's interesting is what happened in Judea, what Hellenization did to Judea. Because if you know anything about the Greek way of life, it is what the Israelites would have called paganism, or basically it's the complete opposite of what God wants for his people. And of course, we'll get into that here in a little bit as to what the ins and outs of that are. But this conquer by the Greeks introduced Hellenization to Judea and Samaria, which is going to cause a lot of problems throughout this short history, these 400 years, especially between parties in Jerusalem. But Hellenization alienated the Jews ultimately. One thing I'd like to point out, the reason being is because if you think about it, these Gentiles, these are uncircumcised people that are coming in and they're conquering these Israelites. And I'll kind of get into it later with Antiochus Epiphanes, but what the Greeks did in Jerusalem it's kind of awful if you're a Jew. Because they started building gymnasiums, they built bathhouses, they built all these things that were, of course, an integral part of Greek culture. But if you're a Jew, it is a nightmare scenario. Because these Gentiles, I don't know if you know this, and I might get some eyes from this, but the gymnasts and the people that competed in the games in Greece, they did it in the nude. And if you know anything about Gentiles, they're not circumcised. So you have these Jews that are wanting to be a part of this Hellenization, but they're circumcised. And so to the Greeks, this is funny looking. And so this alienates them already. And there's plenty of other cultural problems that came along with this, because along with the spread of Hellenization, you have Greeks coming in from Macedonia and living and intermingling with the Jews in Judea. So you have another culture coming in and making it their homeland as well. And so there's just all these problems that occur because it's contrasting cultural beliefs. And then, of course, you'll have people that are wanting to adhere to these beliefs as well. And that's where you get to, in the New Testament, the Hellenists. These are Jewish people that are in support of Hellenization. So when you read in the New Testament, you read about Hellenists, what should come to mind? Who are those people? What'd you say, Jeff?
Greeks.
They're Greeks, but they're Greek Jews. They're Jews that want to be Greek. They're going, okay, I like this Greek culture, so let me be a part of it. I'm in support of this Greek culture. If you want to give, a modern day equivalent of this would be like the difference between conservative Greeks coming in and going, hey, you need to be a part of our culture. Greek way of life is the best way to live. And if you're not going to be a part of it, I'm sorry, you can't be in the empire. And so it's basically forced upon them. Either you conform or you get out. And there's plenty of problems that come from this. But one of the biggest things with Hellenism, it brought the Greek language to the area. And as you know, what is the Old Testament written in? Or the Old Testament. What is the New Testament written in? Greek, Koine Greek. And this is because this language became very, very popular. Even into the Roman times. And we'll kind of get to that here in a little bit. But this language became a very integral part of their society. So now, most Jews in the first century, especially in the Gospels, would have been trilingual. And that includes Jesus. So they would have spoke Hebrew, they would have spoke Aramaic, and they would have spoke Greek. And there's a pie chart in this book, but the vast majority of people in Judea at the time, in the first century, especially in the Gospels, they spoke Aramaic. So as I mentioned earlier, this was formerly the trade language of all the entirety of the Eastern Mediterranean because of the Persians. And it was the main language of the Jews of Palestine and various other people and groups in the region. And then the second biggest language that would have been prevalent in that time would be Greek. So especially in the Roman times, you would think that Latin would be the biggest proponent or the biggest language in that part of the empire, but it wasn't. Latin was really only the more common language in the western part of the empire. In the eastern part of the empire, it was completely culturally different, and it was more Greek than it was Roman. So they spoke more Greek in the eastern part of the empire than they did Latin. But the thing is, in Jesus' time, the Greek language was more of like an educated person's language. So if you went to college or you had a higher level of education, it was Greek. And most scholarly or educational things were written in Greek in that time period. And it was mainly spoken by educated upper-class citizens and business people in Palestine because Greek was the trade language at the time. It was the language that they used when they did business or when government officials were making decrees. And then the third biggest language would have been Hebrew. Of course, the only people that would have spoken Hebrew in Jesus' time would have been the Jews. And that was more for a religious setting as opposed to a common setting or, me talking to you at the dinner table. We would have saved Hebrew for church, basically, is what they would use it for. This was also the time during the time of the Greeks. This was the time that they would have translated the Septuagint, which I mentioned the Septuagint last week. But what the Septuagint is, it's basically the Greek Old Testament. So it's you take the Hebrew scriptures and they took it and they Greekified it. They took the Hebrew scriptures and they translated it to Greek so that it could be dispersed to who? Because all the Jews are located or most of the Jewish population is located where? In Jerusalem and Judea and Palestine. But what did I mention earlier about the diaspora? Who's out there? The Jewish people. There are still more Jewish people out in the greater part of Turkey and Babylon and Syria, and they need something to read that's their scriptures because they've been so far removed from Hebrew teachings and these Hebrew, they need something. And so what do they speak? They speak Greek. And so here they call it the Septuagint because that's basically, it's a transliteration of the word LXX, which is just 70 in Greek numbers, which is supposedly the number of people that it took to translate it into Greek. But anyway, the Septuagint was basically their Bible for the dispersed Jews. That's what they used. And many speculate that that's the scriptures that Jesus used as well, but I would be of the one to argue that Jesus read from Hebrew as well as the Septuagint. But Jesus most likely would have been aware of the Septuagint, and he would have read from it because that would have been the most common writing of the Old Testament at the time would have been the Septuagint. And I didn't list it here. Well, actually, I did list it here. But many of the biblical New Testament authors, when they're alluding to Old Testament scriptures, they're quoting from the Septuagint. They're not quoting from Hebrew scriptures. They're quoting directly from the Septuagint, which I think is pretty cool. So letter B, as it says, after Alexander's untimely death in 323 BC, there became a power vacuum. Because if you go and look at a map of all that Alexander the Great conquered, he conquered all the way from Greece, all the way over really close to China, Mongolia. He even had foothills into India. His empire was massive. And even if he was to be alive, I don't know how, there's no telling how long he would have been able to hold on to that large swath of land. But even immediately after his death, his high-ranking generals and officials fought each other for the empire. And ultimately, the top two that came out on top was the Ptolemy family, or Ptolemy general, and the Seleucids. It was a group of people. So these two empires eventually rose to power. One was Ptolemy in Alexandria's Egypt, and the other one was the Seleucids in the north, in Antioch and in Syria. And if you look at a map, and if you look, Antioch, if Israel is right here, Antioch's going to be above them, and then Alexandria, Egypt's going to be below them. And the geography is kind of important here because to the right on the map of Israel, if you're looking at it, is desert. And no army and no trade routes are going to go through the desert. And so they're basically a highway for empires, for armies, for trade routes. And so they're going to be caught in a tug of war for many, many years between these two fighting powers, between Ptolemy and between the Seleucids. It's going to trade hands a lot. As far as modern history goes, we do know, all of you will be familiar with the leader of the Ptolemaic dynasty. That would be Cleopatra. And so if you know anything about history, she was the last one. And they, of course, were Greek than they were Egyptian. But we know of a little bit, some of us at least are familiar with that dynasty. But as far as history about the Israelites at that time, there was not a lot of literature written. We don't really have a lot of written history about what they were doing at that time or what was going on in Palestine, because it was relatively peaceful under the Ptolemaic dynasty. They let them kind of do their own thing. They didn't really intervene with a lot of things. They weren't overbearing like the Greeks were and like later empires will be, but it was relatively peaceful under that. But the problems really began to arise when the Seleucids took over in 198. And this is where it starts getting really, really bad. And this is where a lot of problems start arising for the Israelites. So in 198, the Antiochus III came to power as the Seleucid king, and he conquered in many battles against the Ptolemaic dynasty. He conquered Judea and he conquered Jerusalem and Israel, shifting the balance of power to now the Seleucids. And then 188 BC, the Seleucids were ultimately defeated by Rome in 188, and they became a vassal state of the Roman Empire. So the Roman Empire was in its infancy at the time. It wasn't as big as it's going to be in Jesus' time. But Rome was still not directly in control of the Seleucid Empire. They were just the masters of the Seleucids, and the Seleucids were the ones ruling over the Israelites. And that's going to become important here in a second. The problems really arised, I would say, and a lot of Jewish people would say, when Antiochus IV, or Antiochus Epiphanes, as he called himself, rose to power in 175. So, as I'm sure many of you read on your outline, the problem arose because Antiochus Epiphanes thought himself a god. He called himself Epiphanes because that word means God revealed. So he thought he was the direct descendant of God or whatever gods he believed in. And he wished the people of Judea to know it. He despised the Jews. He thought that they were just roaches underneath his foot. He could not stand them because to them, who was their God? God the Father, Yahweh. That was their God. But to himself, who was the God? He was the God. And so he has all these problems with that. And not only that, but he's taking his anger out on the Jews, because who is over the Seleucids at this time? The Romans. And the Seleucids are a vassal state. So even though they have their own freedoms to govern themselves, the Romans demand tribute yearly, if not monthly, or I don't know the exact time period. And so he's facing the pressure from the Romans to basically get their payment from him. And so he can't come up with the money. So what does he do? He taxes the dog out of the Jews in Jerusalem. He taxes those people left and right. And not only that, but he loots the temple. He goes in the crown jewel of their society and he takes their treasure. He takes their temple artifacts. He takes all these things that these people hold near and dear to their heart, that they worked hard for, that they fought for their entire lives. And he takes it because he can. And so this angers that population, rightfully so. But not only that, this, I would call it the salt on the wound. He hates them so much that he started taking bids for the seat of the high priest. So if you know anything about your Old Testament, you know that the high priest has to come from a certain lineage and has to be a part of a certain family. And, you know, it's a very distinguished position that is, you have to meet certain requirements or you cannot be it. And Antiochus said, I don't care about all that. I want whoever's going to be the high priest to do my bidding. So he left it and he made it an office of government. And he left it to the highest bidder. And so you have all these families and these people paying money to Antiochus to basically become the high priest because A, Seleucid is in debt to the Romans. They need money. And B, Antiochus wants control of the Jewish population. So he takes that money, he gives it to the Romans, and he now has control over the people that are causing him problems. And the problem arises when the first high priest that was appointed by Antiochus was Jason. And what's kind of interesting is he was actually the brother of the current actual high priest Ananias III. Then later it became Menelaus, but the problem with Menelaus is he had no priestly ancestry. If anything, they suspected he wasn't even really a Jew. He was just kind of a Greek that was born into a Jewish family. But there was plenty of problems with that as well. But Jason also in this time Greekified Jerusalem. He built a gymnasium, but not only did he build a gymnasium, he built it below the temple. So he took this ground that the Israelites, the Jewish people, consider holy, and he built a Greek building underneath it. He built a pagan gymnasium underneath it. And as I listed here, the Greek-style games were held, and Jewish youths competed nude in the style of the Greeks. And not only that, but operations were even performed to reverse circumcisions. Because the Jews wanted to be so like the Greeks, and they wanted to appease these people so badly that they were willing to give up their Jewish heritage. They were willing to give up the one symbol that defined them as God's people. And so I know I kind of mentioned this morning in class, but this is the slow burn that's turning these Jews away from God's people. They're turning them away from their heritage that they had. They're so willing to give up the things that would distinguish them from the other people of the world because the cultural pressures they're facing. And it causes a rift. What happens is you have these Hellenists that arrive, the people that are of this party that they want to appease the Greek overlords, basically. And then you have what are called the Hasidim, or the Holy Ones, which become the conservative party that wants to stick to Jewish traditionalism. And so now you have the Jewish population is now split in two. People that support the Greek movement and people that want to keep the traditions of their forefathers. And so Antiochus is creating this dissension, and it's just not good for the people at the time. But it turned, and if you think all of that is bad, it gets worse for the Jews. This is where it gets horrible, I think, in my eyes. But this is what many people call the abomination of desolation. It is alluded to in Daniel. Jesus even himself alludes to it. It's mentioned in Revelation about what happened. So the situation that happened was Antiochus he wanted to rebel against the Romans, and he wanted to kind of conquer his own land. So he pushes his armies and military campaigns into Egypt outside of Alexandria. And in Alexandria at the time are Romans. Romans have control of Alexandria. So a Roman diplomat met him and ordered him to turn back or face the wrath of Rome. So Antiochus, being a somewhat smart man, knew the power that Rome had over them, and he withdrew in humiliation. And because of his humiliation and his anger, he had to save face. And he knew that many of the people in Jerusalem were still loyal to the Ptolemaic dynasty, because underneath that dynasty, they had relative peace. They left them alone. So they of course, liked the Ptolemaic dynasty. So Antiochus, he took his anger out against the city. So what he did is he went into the temple and he started burning things. He went and he started burning altars. He started burning their treasures. He looted their treasures. He even tore down the city walls of Jerusalem. He started killing thousands of citizens at the whim, people that were in support of the Ptolemaic dynasty. And in the days that followed, he wanted to ultimately destroy Judaism entirely. So he outlawed Sabbath observance. He outlawed circumcision. And keeping the Jewish tradition and law was banned under the Seleucids. Copies of Scripture were confiscated and burned. And on one particular day in 167, he marched straight into the temple. He erected a monument and he erected an altar to Zeus for Olympus, and he set it up in the temple. Then not only that, he took a herd of swine, he took a herd of pigs, and he sacrificed it in the Holy of Holies. He took pigs and he sacrificed it in the place the Jews considered holy. And if you know anything about the Jewish people, what is one thing they cannot eat? Pork. They cannot have pork. That's part of their diet. And what does this man do? He goes into their Holy of Holies. He erects a temple to a pagan god, and he sacrifices pigs in front of all of them. And not only that, but he outlaws everything they know to be true. He outlaws circumcision. He outlaws the adoration to the law, and he kills people on a whim because he can, all because he got hurt that he couldn't conquer the Romans and because he hated the Jews. And so you have now a people that are broken, a people who have ultimately lost everything. The Syrians came in, they conquered them. The Babylonians came in, they conquered them. The Greeks came in, they conquered them and changed their entire culture. The Seleucids, the Ptolemaic dynasty, they came in and conquered them. And the Seleucids not only did that, but they spit in the face of their ancestry. They spit in their face and they completely destroyed everything that they loved. And this is the world that Jesus was coming into. This broken, downcast, depressed people, if you really want to call it that. Because what did they have left? They didn't have anything. They were just abused and used by all sorts of empirical powers. Things wouldn't really get better until about 167 when this, because of the things Antiochus were doing, if you know anything about when, you think about America, when people come and they tax the dog out of you and they treat you horribly, what do you want to do? Get rid of that power. Get rid of them. Rebel. And that's exactly what the Jews did. There was a man, Matthias, and he had a son named Judas. Now, Matthias was a priest, and he was one of the only priests that could really trace his ancestry back to the Levitical tribes. And Antiochus's people wanted him to make a unprofane sacrifice. They wanted him to sacrifice swine, and he wouldn't do it. So they killed some Seleucid officials, and him, his sons, and some of their followers fled to the wilderness. And they took these followers to the mountains and they fought the Seleucids using guerrilla warfare and other tactics. And his Matthias ultimately died during this, but Judas, his son, who is nicknamed Maccabeus, which is Greek for the word hammer, which I think is a really cool nickname, Judas gained control, and eventually through guerrilla warfare and fighting, they took control of the temple and they purified the sanctuary. So they took back Jerusalem, they took back this area from the Seleucids, and they basically had their own independence for many, many, many years. And even today, the Jewish people celebrate this event with Hanukkah, which is the Feast of Dedication. So next time you hear about Hanukkah, that's what it's celebrating, the Jewish victory over the Seleucids. So eventually, they removed Syrian presence entirely in 142, and this lasted for about 80 years of Jewish independence, which ended in 63 BC when the Romans came. And after the Romans came in 63 BC, the nation of Israel would not govern itself until 1948, after World War II. That's a long time. And then, of course, I know there's plenty of problems that we're even seeing today because of all of this. But this is history, people. This is the world that Jesus grew up in, and his, the people after him grew up in as well. These are the problems that he was dealing with. But after the Maccabean revolt and after Judas had died off, they started a selection of what they called priest kings. So they would appoint people to be both priest and king over the Jewish nation as a whole. And this rule would be this ruling would later be called the Hasmonean dynasty. And during this time, they would have territorial expansion. But because of this territorial expansion and their hatred towards pagans, there would be a rift that would become between the Jews and the Samaritans. So all the Samaritans were just dispersed Jews that intermingled with Gentiles. And so these groups of people, they just didn't get along. They started, fighting and conquering each other in this time period, and it just caused problem after problem. And that problem rears its ugly head when we get to the New Testament, when Jesus is dealing with racial problems between Samaritans and Jews. And that's, of course, we have the passage about Jesus and the Samaritan woman in the book of John. But that's the world Jesus was dealing with, and that's the reason why that they had problems with him. But during this time, the Pharisaical party, and they're called the Essenes. They're not mentioned in the Bible, but they were a part of this political party. But the Pharisees and the Essenes became a primary fighting power as far as politically during this time, and that's why the Pharisees are such a high political and respected power in the New Testament, because they took control during the Hasmonean dynasty, and so that's why the Pharisees are what they are. But throwing off this mantle came with a cost. Of course, there was the rise of the religious party of the Pharisees. There's now intensified Jew-Gentile hatred that wasn't even found in the Old Testament, but now is a huge problem. And you can understand why, because what have the Gentiles been to the Jews? Nothing but horrible. And so now the Jews ultimately hate these Gentiles. And not only that, but this era also rekindled the want for a restored kingship. And so at this time, it's written a lot, especially in the Maccabees and some other places. They were long awaiting for the Messiah to come, because they've been under the thumb of massive empires. They've been under Babylon, they've been under Syria, they've been under the Persians, they've been under the Seleucids, the Greeks, the Ptolemaic dynasty. They want someone to rule them that's not a Gentile. They want their Messiah. And so that cry can be heard in the New Testament when they're asking him, are you truly the Messiah? Because they've been waiting for this man to give them independence from these Gentiles. But as we know and read in our New Testament, that's not the kind of nation, that's not the kind of kingdom that Jesus came to establish. But that's what the people wanted, because you got to think about their history. What have they grown up in? The thumb of a Gentile over them. They didn't want that anymore. And that's not what Jesus came to be, and that's not what the scriptures told them that was going to be what Jesus came to do. But that's what they wanted because of what was going on in their lives. And that's what we have to understand when we look at these people in the New Testament, is we look at them and we go, well, how did they not know? They read their scriptures 100 times. How did they not know that that's what Jesus' purpose was? Well, that's your reason. They grew up in a world where all that was being done to them was being conquered. So all they wanted was somebody to come and conquer them and establish an Israelite-led kingdom. That's all they wanted. But that's not Jesus' purpose. But that's the battle that Jesus had to fight, as well as all these other battles he's dealing with racially and culturally in the New Testament. So to kind of close with this, I really believe it to be important to study this and to understand this, because as I've just briefly explained, the way that Jesus handles these certain groups of people and the things that he has to handle in his short ministry is from years and years and years of problems. And Jesus has to unravel all of this just to get across his point of why he came to the earth to do what he needed to do. And so to me, I don't envy Jesus for having to deal with this hundreds of years of issues and problems, and it's just horrible. But this is the world that Jesus had to deal with. And I think it's important for us as Christians to study these things and to remember these things when we're reading the Gospels especially, so we can get a better understanding and a better picture of what the message is trying to get across. I hope today that I was able to, A, explain this good to all of you, but B, that you took something from it. And when you read your Gospel now, I hope you see it in a different light. And some things may mean more to you that Jesus said or did, or they may not. But to me, I know that this opened my eyes to a lot of things and a lot of the problems the Jews faced and a lot of the problems that Jesus faced in his own ministry. But next week, we're going to pick up with the Roman occupation and the Herodian dynasty, and then we're going to cover a little bit of religious context and cultural context. I appreciate it, everybody. I appreciate your time, and I look forward to this every week. But now I'm going to turn it over to Jeremy. We're going to have our song and our prayer, and we'll be dismissed for the day. Thank you, guys.